Hello, and welcome to the Social Protection Podcast. I'm your host, Jo Sharp. Throughout the Indo-Pacific region, climate change is already threatening livelihoods and exacerbating poverty. Extreme weather events and sea level rise are making new populations vulnerable in new ways. And to tackle climate change, countries will need to make major economic and social transformations that risk leaving more people behind. So, what do these changing risks mean for the way we design social protection? And what kinds of radical rethinking might we need to build the systems for the future? My guests today are grappling with these questions right now, working to reimagine social protection schemes to confront the realities of a changing climate. This is the third episode in our special three-part series looking at emerging trends for social protection in the Indo-Pacific region. We have three guests for today's episode. Sreng Sopon Riksamai is Director of the Policy Department at the General Secretariat for the National Social Protection Council for the Government of the Kingdom of Cambodia. Palash Das is the Director of the Ultra Poor Graduation Program for BRAC in Bangladesh. And Anna McCord is the lead for the Climate Change and Social Protection Research Initiative at the Poverty and Inequality Practice. Welcome, Riksamai, Palash, and Anna.
Hello, and it's nice being here.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me here.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Anna, can I start with you? How will projected climate impacts in Asia change the kinds of risks and vulnerabilities that social protection systems will need to respond to?
Thank you, Jo. I think that's a really important question. I mean, we're already starting to see the impacts of climate change, but I think what we can anticipate in the coming decades is a real acceleration of climate change impacts and changing impacts. And the challenge is that these physical impacts, the shocks and stresses that we're going to see, will have a major impact on a whole range of human systems. They're going to disrupt livelihoods, both in direct ways and indirect ways. And really, I think the cumulative effects will have quite significant effects on water security, food security, health infrastructure. So not just the kind of climate shocks that we often think about, events such as flooding or fires, but we're going to be also looking at real economic and labour market disruption. And I think what that's really going to mean for us in the social protection sector is that we have to think about the scale of provision. We're going to have large populations affected simultaneously. And also we're probably going to need new types of social protection. We're going to also need to look at provision for new groups. We might need to think about support for those in coastal areas, in urban areas, and also for those in different kind of geographical areas from where we've been working in the past.
Thanks, Anna. That's a great start. Palash, Bangladesh is one of the most climate vulnerable countries in the world. How are you seeing the needs and vulnerabilities of Bangladeshis changing?
Thanks, Jo. I think that's also an excellent question. And I would like to echo what Anna just mentioned. The climate change is affecting all sorts of security issues, economic security, food security, water security, whatever. And I think that's what we are seeing in Bangladesh. And that is really changing the entire landscape here. What I'd like to mention is that last 5-6 years, what we are observing here, the unpredictability, it's increasing at an exponential rate. So in a country like Bangladesh, where we do have a large number of poor population and the vulnerable population located in vulnerable geographical areas, and imagine the situation of those population getting hit by more cyclone, floods, erratic rainfall, the unpredictability and the intensity and the frequency of all those climate extreme events, those are changing the whole level of vulnerabilities here. And the needs, we are trying to identify the needs of those poor population, of those vulnerable population, but those are also changing.
Thank you. And then staying with you to talk a little bit about the program that you lead, BRAC's Ultra Poor Graduation Approach. That quite famous approach is all about supporting the very poorest people to move out of poverty through a kind of bundled set of interventions, including cash transfers to cover basic needs, but also the provision of an income-generating asset transfer, like something that people can use to generate income, as well as coaching and training for participants to help them really move on and move out of poverty. This approach has evolved over the 20 years or so I believe it has been operating. So I'm interested now in how it's evolving to face the climate challenges, and perhaps particularly that unpredictability and some of those other things you mentioned in your answer just now. How is BRAC rethinking the graduation approach to build resilience in the face of the changing climate?
This is the question of what we all have been asking ourselves almost 4 or 5 years. The key question is that the graduation approach, what we know right now, is it still relevant to address all the climate change related shocks that the poor people are facing? Is it still relevant to address the poverty reduction at the same time addressing inequality overall? And having said that, we have been considering seriously. One is about the whole social protection, and another one is about the whole empowerment process. Those two are categorically inbuilt and integrated in the whole graduation approach, along with livelihood security and the financial inclusion. So what we have also identified is that we need to have right kind of targeting. And based on the targeting, we need to really understand what sort of comprehensive intervention packages will be required for them. Earlier, in case of Bangladesh and also in other countries, I'm sure, we used to see poverty in rural nature. And last 10, 15 years, we have started seeing poverty in urban nature. So what we are seeing is that within a tiny country like Bangladesh, it's no more rural and urban. In case of ultra-poor graduation program in Bangladesh, we have already identified 2 clear issues. One is that water security. That is going to affect everything. And we don't know how to address that. And second is salinity. The salinity in the whole coastal part is really affecting everything. So keeping these 2 things in mind, we have divided the whole Bangladesh in 4 parts. The whole coastal belt and the dry land, which is basically northern part of Bangladesh, and the river basin and the flood-prone areas, and as Anna mentioned, also urban areas. So these are the 4 areas we have identified that we have different targeting criteria for 3 different regions and completely separate targeting criteria for urban areas. And based on those targeting criteria, our programmatic intervention, the design of implementation and interventions are completely different.
Riksamai, coming to you, what are the risks that the social protection system in Cambodia are set up to address?
Thank you. I think this is a very important question because Cambodia is one of the countries in Southeast Asia who is very vulnerable to shocks, especially the climate shocks. Flood is the most frequent one. In every 2 years, we face a severe flood. But right now, we are also seeing the rise of drought and also storm and cyclone. And lightning is happening almost every time there is a big storm. Most frequently, now we are also thinking of having a response to those shocks as well. And social protection has played very important tools to help people affected, especially to have those who are in need, like poor and vulnerable households. And the social protection system in Cambodia also address the underlying development and also the condition of the household, as we are not rich country, let's say, we are still having poverty and vulnerability, especially people living in the rural area.
One way that social protection addresses climate change can be by responding to those shocks and disasters. How is the government of the Kingdom of Cambodia thinking about building a more shock responsive and adaptive social protection system?
So actually, the concept of shock responsive social protection and adaptive social protection later was quite new to Cambodia. We only talk about shock responsive social protection in 2020 when we faced the COVID-19, but also the severe flood. That's when the government thinking of having responses from social protection system to help those affected. And at the time, there was 2 measures. The first one is to immediately help those households by introducing an emergency cash transfer for poor and vulnerable households in response to COVID-19, and also those affected by flood. And at the time, since it's new concept, the development partners also support the government by providing additional supports to those households affected by flood at that time, because the government is facing a COVID-19 crisis. So we are focusing on responding to them. And the second measure is the government point out for us to develop a framework, a shock responsive framework, so that in the future, if unfortunately we are facing severe shock or natural disaster, we have a framework where the government can react on social protection to respond to those shocks. And in that framework, the most important part is that it's pointing out to have an institutional setup, who's doing what. And then it's also pointing out many priority activities or the action need to be taken by the government institutions to build the resilience of social protection system, and also to build preparedness to respond to shock.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear also that point about needing to respond to multiple shocks of different kinds simultaneously. And I think that really speaks to the point that both Anna and Polash made about the changing vulnerabilities and also the need to be thinking about the different kinds of groups and the different kinds of needs. Are there particular ways that the programs themselves are changing around, perhaps the way they're targeted or the expansion of coverage or any of those sorts of things that the government is also thinking about in order to enable those shock responsive systems to work?
Yeah, I think you touched on a critical point. It's actually happening in Cambodia. In 2020, we responded to shock to COVID-19 by just supporting those who are in poverty. We have a system called ID Poor program, which identify poor household, and through the digitalized system, labeling they are in extreme poor or poor, so that the government can provide social assistance to them. So at the time, we only have those households in the system. But then in 2020, we have faced another two shocks actually on top of COVID-19. Is the flood I mentioned earlier, and also the high inflation from the rise of prices. So the government want to provide interventions to those two shocks as well. Since poor households already have support from the government, at the time, the government institution involved to identify more people. So at the time, we are the Ministry of Planning, who has the mandate to do the identification those households. They expand the ID Poor program to cover at least household referred to near poor household, those not living near the poverty line, but also help one of the vulnerability, like having member or a person with disability, elderly, single-headed female household, or having children. So we identified 1.81 million people. That's equals to 500,000 households on top of 3 million people, 700,000 poor households. So at the time, we expand the ID system to cover more people. So because of the shocks, we actually have identified more people and having their data and information in the system. So right now, if, for example, unfortunately, we face another shocks, then we have those data of households who are poor, but also near poor.
Yeah, it's so important, isn't it? And it's really interesting to hear how the ID Poor program, which I understand is poverty targeted, to think about broadening out into some of those more kind of categorical at-risk groups. Anna, coming back to you now, what are some of the other ways we could be rethinking social protection for climate mitigation and adaptation?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. I mean, building on the analysis that Palash and Rixmay have given us of the problems, I think one of the roles of social protection is that it can actually help governments to respond to some of the medium-term challenges of climate change. And one area is it can really help promote adaptation, recognizing the challenges that there to existing livelihoods due to climate changes, change in rainfall, change in heat profiles, changes in water availability. And so what social protection can do is that the cash transfers can actually help households to make decisions to adapt their livelihood strategies, perhaps diversifying out of existing agricultural livelihood approaches that they're using, perhaps even migrating. And I think this is a key role because having additional cash in the household means that households can make these choices to adapt to the medium-term stresses resulting from climate change. So not just becoming more resilient to shocks, but also looking at changing their livelihood strategies. But there's also a couple of other areas which are perhaps less prevalent at the moment, but I think will become really important in the future. And one is that social protection can be used to actually help address issues of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon sequestration, ecosystems restoration. And I think there's a real opportunity as labour markets are disrupted to use public employment programs, for example, large-scale government employment programs, to address some of the ecosystems and carbon sequestration challenges that are being faced. And in this way, social protection can both enhance household income security and compensate for the loss of livelihoods, but also contribute to the achievement of national climate change goals. And I think we're seeing some examples of this in the region. I mean, in India, there's an explicit alignment of the NREGA, the large-scale national public employment program, with national water conservation strategies. And so the two sets of programs, climate programs and social protection programs, are aligned in a way which means that social protection can also be contributing to climate change objectives. And there's one other area which is really quite significant, which is that national climate change mitigation policies can actually adversely affect poor populations. If we think about, for example, the introduction of different carbon pricing instruments and fuel subsidy reductions, which are a major instrument being promoted to reduce carbon consumption, these have quite a significant impact on the price of basic goods. And so here, there's a clear role for the simultaneous introduction of social protection programs, cash transfers, alternative subsidies to compensate the poor for the adverse impacts of these programs. I think we've seen throughout the region, also in Africa and in Europe, that the introduction of these carbon pricing policies without compensatory mechanisms to offset the impacts on the poor really undermines public acceptability in the success of these kind of climate mitigation strategies. And the other area which we don't always think about is that the just transition, the introduction of green economies, the phasing out of polluting industries is going to entail quite significant job losses in many countries in the region. And these are often concentrated in particular geographical areas. And as well as affecting those directly employed in these industries, there are significant impacts on all those working in supporting industries and in the informal sector around them. And so I think the other role for social protection is actually looking at how active labour market policies, job subsidies, job training, these kind of interventions can really help people. So we need to really be thinking about the price impacts and the labour market impacts of these climate change mitigation policies. And this is really an important area where the alignment of your industrial policy, your economic policy, and social protection policies needs to take place.
Some of the things you're talking about here really are at the vanguard of how we need to be thinking about these enormous economic and social transitions that we're moving towards. With that in mind, Rixamai, how else is Cambodia looking at making some of its existing programs better support climate adaptation and mitigation objectives, like some of the ones that Anna has just touched on?
Yeah, so I think what Anna mentioned earlier is all valid. I think for Cambodia, besides providing cash transfer to poor households and those who are in need, vulnerable, but the at-risk household as well, is to provide a means or opportunity for them to acquire skill training. So in 2023, we are introducing TVET program, social assistance TVET program, by providing free skill training, classic TVET program duration 1 year for one certificate level. But in this particular program, we are focusing on shorten it, compact it, so that people from those backgrounds are willing or attractive for them to join, right? Because they don't want to invest like 1 year and not being able to secure a job after. So the idea is to provide a compact cost, free training, skill training cost, but also providing allowance to them so that they offset the opportunity cost for them to join the training. So we start with 10 skills, the traditional one, and the one which support the economy to the tourism, mechanics, electronics, ICT, the small literacy skill, and so on. But we are looking at having more curriculums with the support from development partners so that to make the program maybe more green and technology based. Because in the future, we are looking at more technology kind of jobs. For example, right now we have an increase of platform economy, especially with the Grab, Food Panda, for example, local apps and so on. So the government is also looking to introduce some costs so that to provide digital literacy and some more financial literacy for youth as well. So on top of the cash transfer, we are having these all active labor market programs. For us, we think that these programs, a combination of these programs, are going to build the resilience of the people, right? And then on top of that, we are also having cash forward programs. It's not a national program. It's a temporary intervention when there's a shocks or return migrants or in particular area where they face issue, damage infrastructure and so on. This program kicks in so that we hire people at the community, especially the rural area, to help build the small infrastructure for their community. So this program actually now at the stage where we're only focusing on targeting and as a temporary mechanism to support the community. But in the next policy framework, the government has the vision to institutionalize the cash forward program to a national program so that, like Anna has mentioned, it could be a very potential program to help with climate change.
Thank you. Polash, coming back to you now, I wanted to ask you particularly about coaching. It's a feature of the graduation approach and many other cash plus social protection approaches. What opportunities does that personal engagement offer to help communities find ways to adapt to climate change in particular?
What I'd like to really mention is not only about coaching, and it's also about providing them other information related to climate change at the household level, how they are going to be affected, and also at the community level and also beyond. And also slowly preparing not only that particular household, but also preparing the entire community. When we are making them aware about the potential risk and other impacts due to climate change, at the same time, getting the ownership from them. Everybody's talking about locally led adaptation. I mean, one of the core elements when it is about locally led adaptation or community led adaptation, it's are we really making it for them? Are really developing something together? It's not only making them aware, but also designing something together. The moment we talk about engaging with the household or the community, we know that there are certain issues which require involvement beyond community, which requires involvement from the state. So when it is about water security, solving household level safe drinking water problem or salinity will not be enough. We need to come up with something, say, broader, geographic, say location-wide kind of a system. So while providing them information, getting them ready in relation to dealing with the issues at the household level, at the same time, the opportunity of having their voices in the whole process, which need to be dealt from the state level, having communities in the whole process through coaching, mentoring, and the hand-holding services. It is important to inform some of the government-led program, what Rix mentioned, and some of the government-led program, what we are seeing here in Bangladesh, perhaps in other countries also, we are trying to develop here.
Anna, you touched on migration earlier, and climate-related disasters are already displacing large numbers of people annually. Countries in South Asia, for example, have some of the highest rates of migration due to climate-related disasters in the world. How could we start to rethink social protection to better respond to the needs of internal migrants, but also transboundary migrants who might be moving between countries?
Yeah, I think this is a really critical question, and it relates not just to climate shocks, but also to these medium-term climate-related stresses. And I think if we take into consideration the negative impacts on the viability of traditional livelihoods, if we look at the kind of broader labour market disruption, economic disruption that we're likely to see as a result of climate change, and the competition for scarce resources, which Polash mentioned, with scarcity of drinking water, water for irrigation, challenges around energy provision, I think it's very likely that we're going to see a significant increase in population movements, both within countries and across borders in the coming decades. And indeed, this is something that the UNFCCC has predicted in its latest analytical report. And so what this means is that what we're seeing is that some people are reaching the limits to adaptation. Their livelihoods are no longer viable in situ where they are. And so people will be migrating in search of livelihoods, in search of income. For example, looking at flooding in certain areas of the Mekong Delta, and it will no longer be possible to pursue livelihoods in many coastal areas in the region. And this is likely to lead to really major population movements. And so what does that mean for us in the sector? Well, the one thing is we need to be thinking about the portability of social protection interventions, because many interventions currently actually tie people to a particular location. They're conditional on you remaining in a particular location. And I think we have to perhaps break this link between domicile and the provision of social protection. So we don't want to actually restrict people's adaptive capacities through the way that we administer social protection. But more than that, we need to be thinking about the issue of people crossing borders. And so we need to be looking at things like interoperable systems, so that systems which are operating on one side of the border can also be implemented on the other. We need to be thinking about ID and registration systems which can operate across borders. And we need to be thinking about things like regional social security agreements, whereby there's a formal negotiation between neighbouring governments about integrating and respecting social protection provision. This, of course, links into the idea of the rights of climate migrants and climate refugees and how these can be respected.
Polash, it's really struck me as you've been speaking, these external factors that are being brought to bear on the lives of the communities where you work, things like water security, energy security, which just, put added pressure on populations that are already so vulnerable and really do require that kind of systematic or systemic approach. The graduation approach, I guess my sense of it is that it is quite individually focused, and it really is about working with people and families and communities to move them through a process so that they can graduate from poverty. Do these additional stressors, does it challenge the very idea of graduation? And how is BRAC thinking about what graduation looks like in the context of climate change, where so much may be changing around people?
Thanks, Joe. Rightly pointed out. In fact, we have been discussing about this again for quite a long time. As you rightly mentioned, within graduation approach, it is too much household focused, and we try to understand or address the risk associated within households. But the moment we talk about water security, energy security, health-related issues, or livelihoods-related issues, and considering internal migration, and so that goes beyond household. So the whole question is about the current graduation approach. Is it creating or giving a big push enough, or the big push is enough to get them out of poverty and keep them there? Is it sustainable? So there, what we are thinking within the graduation approach is that if risks are involved, and we are seeing much more unpredictable risk, and also intensity is higher, and we don't know what would be the cost there, we are thinking, how can we come up with more insurance kind of products within that? And can that go beyond household to community? Can we involve the private sectors there? For instance, we have been trying to come up with flood insurance, crop insurance, health insurance for poor people living in extreme poverty. And we couldn't come up with the right kind of commercial or a viable kind of a solution for them. Nobody was really ready. Then we had to come up with the community approach. We had to bring many households together and had to create that product in a sense. So basically, we are running right now some of the health insurance related pilot for those ultra poor households, crop insurance, and also flood insurance related to disaster for them. This is one aspect which certainly will go beyond household to community. The second aspect is that what Anna also mentioned, the diversification of livelihoods is already inbuilt within the graduation approach. But we are now considering, so what sort of skills we are going to provide them if they even migrate internally from rural area to one of the largest urban area. And that means basic financial management, having immediate access to cash and start running some business in the formal economy. The third is that cash transfer is fantastic, but cash transfer will not work if we don't have a central system wherever the person goes, if the state is not ready to track them. I mean, these people, they cannot go back to their rural areas or the villages or their hometown to claim those the supports of the system. So we have to have a system in place which will categorically address this mobility.
Thank you. That's a really fascinating set of thinking about how the program or the approach needs to evolve. And as I mentioned before, this is a program that's been evolving for a long time and has been emulated in other countries. So really interesting to hear how you're thinking that through. This episode is part of a series on emerging trends and issues for social protection in the Indo-Pacific. We're talking about where new frontiers are emerging for social protection practice. In the context of climate change, many countries in the region and certainly globally are not yet even able to provide even basic levels of social protection for their citizens, let alone address the changing risks due to climate change. Where do we need to do some radical rethinking if social protection is going to really step up to meet these enormous challenges that we've discussed today?
Thanks, Jo. That's quite a question. I think there are a number of ways that we could approach this problem, but perhaps there's just a few key issues. The first one is I think it's critical that governments understand the implications of climate change for poverty, because it's not going to be more of the same. We're going to be in a very different environment. We're not just looking at incremental changes. It's very likely that we'll see the compounding effects of the different processes that we've been talking about. And so there needs to be a large-scale institutional response to this. So on the one hand, I think it's imperative that the government really look at integrating social protection policy and their climate policies, because social protection will be absolutely necessary to ensure equity, a just transition, and even, I might say, geopolitical stability, because it's crucial that people have sufficient resources to meet their basic needs. And there is going to be disruption of their ability to meet their basic needs themselves. So I think the most important thing is really to look at this question of policy alignment and to recognize that social protection has a key role to play in achieving the desired climate outcomes and the successful implementation of climate change mitigation policies. I mean, perhaps there's two other aspects associated with that. One is clearly we need to look at financing issues because there will be resource implications. We need to look regionally and internationally. We need to look at the new kind of instruments that could be used to finance these poverty impacts, which are really caused by global development processes. And I think the other thing is that we need to start looking at the problem also from a regional perspective. We need to think about these issues of regional social security plans and agreement. And we need to start thinking how we can address this systemically at a large scale rather than on a project by project basis. I think the key issue for us to bear in mind as a community is that there's actually now a small window of opportunity to address the challenges that we know are coming. And then it's really crucial that as a sector, we scale up our ambition and recognize the kind of compounding impacts that climate change is going to have on human systems and the implications for poverty. And we know that many tens, if not hundreds of millions of people are going to be pulled into poverty. Those in poverty are going to be further impoverished by climate change. And it's really crucial that we strategically develop social protection, which is informed by these climate change projections before time runs out.
Thank you. Polash, following on from this, you've talked a lot about how you see the graduation approach evolving and also the need for kind of government systems and other, even private sector, to be responding in different ways. Do you have any final thoughts about what kind of radical rethinking of social protection might be necessary?
Oh, yes. I don't know whether it is radical or not. I think it's needed. It is what we all have to do. I mean, based on our experiences also working with these poor communities last 20 years, and specifically last few years, addressing the some known climate risk faced by them. This is our target. If government knows it very well, why can't government come up with something? So for instance, for Bangladesh, the extreme poor population is 5.6% right now. And government knows where they are located in various geographic locations because government is running program there. Why can't government come up with a community-wide insurance scheme for them, addressing the known risk? Second is that in the coastal areas, we know that people are moving. So I think it's the government's responsibility at this moment, coming up with some sort of system, including cash transfer or cash support in parts of Bangladesh where they are moving. Government knows it very well. These are the two things I think we need to deal with immediately.
Thank you. So finally, Rekshamai, as we've been discussing, it's hard enough sometimes to reach people who are in need today. And of course, now we're talking about trying to anticipate who will be in need tomorrow and a really complex set of social and economic shifts that we might start to try to anticipate. What are the challenges for governments in trying to expand systems like these and also project forward in the way that we've been describing today?
It's a good question. Actually, we are facing a lot of challenges. So social protection system in Cambodia just started 2019, I would say. That's the growth. Before there was, but in ad hoc basis and mostly developed partners-driven programs, not government. But we face, when there's a huge expansion, we face financing social protection issue. During COVID-19, the government has no additional resources, but using the government savings to reprioritize other priority and to put into social protection to respond to shocks. Then now come post-crisis, right? Currently, we are having no more critical effect from COVID-19. So post-crisis, we are not leaving people. We have the principle of leaving no one behind. So with that, we have a long-term social assistance program we call family package. And the financing of this family package, it's a integrated social assistance program providing support to cover the life cycle of the households. It's already a challenge because after the shocks, the responses made to those shocks, the government has the resources shrink. So right now, any critical expansion needs to take a cautious step. So we have built policies framework, which focusing on contributory schemes. Besides, the government provides support to those who are in need, but we are, focusing on developing the contributory schemes so that those who are able to support themselves can pay contribution to their supports. And then we're also thinking of having or linking to climate change, right? And we are still exploring, like I mentioned from the beginning, we are quite new in the concept. We're also thinking of how we could link social protection to climate fund. There's many global and regional initiatives regarding that. So yeah, we are looking forward to that as well. And for other social protection schemes like health protection scheme and so on, we are having a roadmap to achieve universal health coverage. So with that, we are not going to expand in one day or 1 year, but we are looking at steps to achieve that and how we can finance it so that we have a sustainable system. We don't want to provide in 1 year and then the system collapse without any financing to support the system.
Thank you. And it really underscores that incredible trajectory, as you say, from 2019 to 2024 and just how much you're trying to put in place over a very rapid period. But again, underscoring that for many countries, this is still a really emerging field. Thank you so much for this really rich discussion. And it is just fascinating to hear how you were all thinking about this in a really live and current way, rethinking the systems that you have or the programs that you're working on with a view to this looming challenge. Rekshamai, Polash and Anna, thank you so much for joining me on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you for having me today, and it's a great pleasure to speaking with all of you.
Well, thank you so much for having me here too. I think this is such a rich discussion, and we learned a lot. I learned a lot, and this is important. We have to have it.
Thank you very much.
As we were making this episode, climate change-related disasters occurred in Brazil, Oman, United Arab Emirates, Kenya, Tanzania, and France. As you heard from our guests today, the impacts of climate change are increasingly evident, leading to more frequent and severe disasters. If you're looking for ways to directly support people affected by these and other disasters, please refer to National Appeals, or you can also contribute to the UN Central Emergency Response Fund's Climate Action, which pools contributions from across the globe into a single fund and allocates money to humanitarian partners on the front lines of emergency responses when climate-related disasters strike. The link is available in the episode's page. Before we go, we like to end each episode with some quick wins. We ask a guest to bring in some recommendations for research, news, or events that have sparked their interest and that we think you, the listener, should know more about. Joining us for Quick Wins today is Inge Stockel, who is an independent social protection consultant working on a range of social protection assignments in the Asia-Pacific region. Welcome to the Social Protection Podcast.
Thanks, Jo. It's great to be with you.
So in this episode, we've been rethinking social protection in the context of climate change, and the focus has been on South and Southeast Asia. Your pick brings us back to the Pacific region, which is where we started this series. What does the first paper that you're bringing in say about the prospects for anticipatory action in the Pacific and the role social protection could play?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. There's been a much greater focus on anticipatory action in the Pacific over the last few years, and there's been some interesting work happening. So the first paper I'd like to share is a recent paper from the Humanitarian Advisory Group called On the Front Foot, Envisaging a Model for Anticipatory Action in the Pacific. So it essentially takes stock of the anticipatory action discussions and approaches in the Pacific and suggests ways to take this forward. I think it's important to understand that the current anticipatory action agenda is largely driven by international actors to make the humanitarian system more efficient, more effective in saving lives and protect livelihoods. The paper highlights, though, that anticipatory actions are actually not new in the Pacific, particularly at the community level. They may have called it differently or not called it anything at all, but early warning systems and locally driven initiatives at the community level to reduce the impact of hazards have existed for a very long time. So in this context, one of the key messages that I wanted to highlight is that any early action approach between governments and international actors should build on and value, support, but also learn from these local Pacific experiences and practices. It also discusses the role of formal social protection systems and that the role they can play as part of an anticipatory action approach by providing top-ups or broadening the reach of payments ahead of a hazard event. And as part of this, HAG notes that it's important to strengthen social protection systems so they can be effectively used as an anticipatory action approach.
Yes, it's an exciting emerging area of practice. And in our March episode, the first episode in this little series, we heard from Vremo Muria, who is a director at the Department of Social Welfare in Fiji. And he mentioned that Fiji is starting to look at anticipatory action. So it's certainly something to watch in this region.
Yeah, and the government of Fiji and the UN actually recently agreed on an anticipatory action framework for tropical cyclones, financed through the UN Central Emergency Response Fund to serve. They agreed thresholds for activation, which will trigger pre-agreed actions. And one of these actions is to use the Fiji existing social protection programs for top-up payments, additional payments ahead of a hazard event to help people take preemptive actions. So that's really exciting. And I think it's an arrangement that will provide further learning for the region as well.
And we can share a link to the Fiji Anticipatory Action Framework that you've just mentioned in the show notes. So that brings us to your next choice.
Yeah, I also brought a paper from the Australian Pacific Climate Partnership titled The Economics of Acting Early, Evidence of Climate and Disaster Actions in the Pacific. It looks at the cost benefits of different early actions. And the key message from these case studies is very clear, that there is economic value in acting early. So the case studies demonstrated that early actions such as early warning and early action information through women's networks and pre-hazard insurance payouts have greater economic benefits than post-disaster response. So the Fiji case study, for example, which looked at the cost benefit of existing parametric microinsurance for social assistance recipients, estimated an increased purchasing power of 37 to 41% for pre-hazard insurance payouts compared to post-hazard payouts. So that's very significant, and it's great and useful to have this evidence for future policymaking.
Thanks, Inga. And something I thought was really interesting about this case study is that when it looks at the sources of support that vulnerable people rely on post-disaster, it does consider the value of, I think it's pronounced kere kere, or my Pacifica friends can correct me, but it's essentially the practice of informal social protection, the sharing or gift giving within communities. And that's considered alongside the value of formal social protection, other sources of income like work and remittances. And as you flagged earlier, and we also talked about in our Pacific episode, these informal networks are a really key aspect of community resilience. So it's really important and interesting to see them so explicitly factored into this economic analysis.
Yeah, I really agree, Joe. And talking about community resilience, there is also a very interesting case study on the critical role of women's networks in early warning and early action in Vanuatu, and how this approach has helped also change social norms. So it's definitely worth looking at the other case studies in this paper as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Inga, for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast today.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Social Protection Podcast. And a special thanks to our friends at Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for inspiring this series and connecting us to guests for this episode. Just a quick note for those who listen to this podcast on Google Podcasts. You might know that Google is closing that platform, so look for us on YouTube Music instead. We are a production of socialprotection.org. Follow us on Twitter at SP_gateway and find us on Facebook, YouTube and LinkedIn. Back next month. See you then.